I spent years quietly building a $310,000 lakeside cottage for my parents' 40th anniversary, a debt-free sanctuary. But arriving after a frantic text, I found my sister's SUV, an unfamiliar truck, fresh surveyor stakes, and a stranger holding paperwork for my father. They saw this gift as collateral to save a sinking empire. My revenge wouldn't begin with screaming. I would simply let them walk deeper into the trap they mistook for victory. I am Nicole Hawthorne. I am 34 years old, and for the last 8 years, I have made a living dissecting the legal traps buried deep within commercial real estate deals. I work in land entitlement and zoning. I read the fine print so corporate empires do not swallow my clients whole. I know what a threat looks like on paper. I know how a single, well-placed clause in a 50-page document can strip a person of everything they own. But I never expected to find one sitting on my parents' dining room table. It started with a text message. I was sitting in a windowless conference room on the 14th floor of my firm, grinding through a brutal, 400-page title review for a downtown commercial high-rise. The air was stale, smelling of old coffee and dry erase markers. My phone vibrated against the polished mahogany table. I glanced down, expecting an update from a junior associate. It was my father. "Come now. Do not call." 4 words. No punctuation at the end. I stared at the bright screen, my heart skipping a painful beat. My father is a man who signs his text messages with his full name. He uses the voice-to-text feature to write meandering, multi-paragraph messages about the weather, the score of the baseball game, or the birds outside his window. He does not send urgent, cryptic commands. He does not demand things, especially not now. Not when he should be resting in the sanctuary I just built for him. I stood up immediately. I gathered my files, shoved my laptop into my leather bag, and walked out of the meeting without a single word of explanation to the senior partners. I took the stairs down to the parking garage because waiting for the elevator felt like a fatal delay. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel of my sedan so tightly, my knuckles ached as I merged onto the interstate. The drive to the lake usually takes exactly 55 minutes. I pushed the engine hard, weaving through the midday traffic. I made it in 40. Every mile marker that flashed by only tightened the heavy knot in my stomach. Just 1 month ago, I handed my parents the keys to a custom-built Lakeside Cottage. It was my gift for their 40th wedding anniversary. It was not just a piece of real estate. It was a fortress. It was a single story, fully accessible, completely debt-free haven. I spent $310,000 of my own savings to ensure my father could navigate the space with his spinal injury. And so my mother could finally breathe after decades of caregiving. There was no mortgage. There were no landlords. There was no financial leverage for anyone to exploit. It was supposed to be untouchable, a place for them to grow old in absolute peace. I turned off the paved county highway onto the narrow dirt and gravel road, leading down to the water. The tires crunched loudly in the quiet. Crisp afternoon air. Pine branches scraped against the windows of my car. The moment the property came into view through the clearing, my foot slammed on the brake pedal. Something was very wrong. Parked right at the base of the wide, ramped front porch steps was a gleaming white luxury SUV. I knew that car instantly. It belonged to my older sister, Mallory Voss, parked beside it, angled aggressively across the crushed stone driveway as if claiming the territory. Was a heavy-duty black pickup truck with commercial plates I did not recognize. I killed the engine and stepped out of my car. The wind coming off the lake was biting, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. But that was not what made the hair on my arm stand up. I looked down toward the gentle slope of the shoreline, plunged deep into the manicured grass, spaced precisely 20 feet apart, was a perfectly straight line of wooden stakes. Each one was topped with a fluttering ribbon of neon orange plastic. Surveyor stakes. My chest went ice cold. My professional instincts flared to life, screaming a warning. I work in entitlement. You do not drive surveyor stakes into a residential lawn unless you are pulling permits to build. expanding a footprint, or subdividing a parcel for commercial rezoning. You do not measure land unless you are preparing to monetize it. No one had any right to measure this land. I jogged toward the house, my heels sinking slightly into the gravel. My mother, Elaine, was standing on the wraparound porch. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon, but she was still wearing her heavy fleece bathrobe, her arms wrapped tightly around her waist as if she were freezing. Her face was the color of old parchment, completely drained of blood. She looked fragile, terrified, and utterly exhausted. She did not speak as I took the wooden steps 2 at a time. She just looked at me with wide, pleading eyes and subtly tilted her head toward the heavy front door. I pushed the oak door open. The interior of the cottage, usually bathed in warm, golden sunlight and smelling of fresh cedar wood, felt like the inside of a hostile courtroom. The silence was absolute, thick, and suffocating. My father, Robert, sat at the head of the custom-built dining table. His posture was unnaturally rigid. His knuckles were bone white where he gripped the wooden armrests of his wheelchair. Sitting directly in front of him, stark against the polished wood grain, was an uncapped, heavy black fountain pen. He looked up at me as I entered. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles beneath his skin twitched. He looked like a man being held hostage in his own dining room. Then I heard the soft, rhythmic, mechanical hum of machinery coming from the open kitchen. I shifted my gaze. A man I had never seen before was standing at the granite island. I had picked out that island specifically to accommodate my father's wheelchair height. The man was dressed in a sharp, slate-gray business suit, the jacket unbuttoned. He was calmly feeding a stack of thick, legal-sized paper into a sleek, portable document scanner. Pinned to his lapel was a silver magnetic name tag bearing the logo of a boutique private equity and wealth management firm. This was not a casual social visit. This was a closing. Footsteps sounded from the hallway leading to the guest bedroom. Mallory appeared. Her hair was perfectly styled in effortless, expensive waves. She wore a pristine cashmere sweater and designer denim, looking exactly like she had stepped out of a catalog for wealthy suburban mothers. When she saw me standing in the entryway, her posture shifted immediately. She tilted her head, softening her eyes, projecting a practiced, artificial warmth that made my blood run completely cold. She offered a soft, wounded smile. It was the exact expression she always used whenever she was about to play the victim. A mask she wore whenever she was doing something indefensible. "You finally made it," Mallory said, her voice dripping with condescending relief. She crossed her arms, acting as though my arrival was an inconvenience to a perfectly reasonable, mundane afternoon. "There is no need to look so dramatic. We are just trying to protect the family assets." I did not answer her. I did not scream. I did not demand to know what the hell she was doing in my house. My professional instincts, honed over thousands of hours of dissecting hostile corporate contracts, took over entirely. Emotion is a massive liability when you are standing in the middle of a minefield. You do not panic. You look for the detonator. I walked past her, completely ignoring the sickly sweet scent of her expensive floral perfume. I walked straight into the kitchen, right up to the granite island where the stranger in the suit was organizing his scanned papers. I placed my hand flat on the top of the thickest stack of documents, pressing down firmly, stopping him from moving them. He looked up, startled, his eyes widening in surprise, but I did not look at him. My eyes were locked on the heavy, cream-colored cover page of the master file lying beneath my palm. The text was printed in bold, uncompromising, embossed black ink, Hawthorne Legacy Holdings, founding documents and operating agreement. The air in my lungs turned to ice. A holding company, an operating agreement. They were not just tricking my father into signing a high-interest loan. They were executing a total restructuring of the ownership of the property. They were stripping the deed from my parents' names and placing it into a corporate entity. In a matter of seconds, the entire horrific picture snapped into sharp focus. The surveyor stakes in the yard, the portable scanner, the private equity consultant, the terrified text message. Mallory and her husband were not here to visit. They did not view this beautiful, tranquil cottage as a sanctuary for our disabled father and exhausted mother. They looked at the $310,000 of pristine, debt-free equity I had painstakingly built from the ground up, and they saw a financial lifeline. They saw the ultimate collateral to bail out whatever massive financial disaster they had created this time. They thought they had already won. They thought my parents were too tired, too confused, and too polite to fight back. They thought I was too late to stop the ink from drying on the page. I kept my hand firmly planted on the documents. I slowly lifted my head and met Mallory's gaze across the tense room. Her fake, wounded smile faltered just a fraction of an inch, revealing the anxious greed underneath. She expected me to lose my temper. She expected a loud, emotional, sisterly shouting match that she could easily twist to make herself look like the rational, caring daughter in front of the man in the suit. But I was not going to yell. You do not scream at a thief when you catch them with their hands inside the vault. You just quietly lock the vault door. Step back and watch them slowly realize they are trapped. I am a senior director at Northvale Entitlement Group. We are a firm that handles title risks, zoning anomalies, and complex property disputes for commercial developers and large-scale residential projects. My entire professional life revolves around dissecting the anatomy of a real estate deal. My days are spent digging through municipal archives, tracing deeds back through generations of convoluted ownership, and cross-referencing obscure local ordinances. My job has turned me into the kind of person who looks at a pristine, beautifully drafted legal document and instantly starts searching for the blade. Because there is always a blade. Corporate entities do not bury clauses in 8-point font at the bottom of page 42 because they are feeling generous. They do it because they want to bleed you dry legally, and they want you to smile while they do it. This hypervigilance is not a natural personality trait. It is a defense mechanism. It was hammered into my core when I was 20 years old, the year my grandmother nearly lost the small, single-story ranch house she had lived in for 45 years. A predatory lender had knocked on her door on a sunny Tuesday afternoon, offering a friendly smile and a reverse mortgage refinancing package wrapped up in bright promises of financial freedom and a comfortable retirement. The paperwork she signed was a labyrinth of ballooning interest rates, hidden default triggers, and clauses designed specifically to confuse an elderly woman. By the time my family realized what she had actually agreed to, the bank was exactly 60 days away from foreclosing on the only home she had left. We pooled every single dime we had, took out personal loans, and hired a vicious attorney to fight the bank. We saved the house, but I never forgot the look of sheer, helpless terror on her face when she realized she had signed her own sanctuary away. That was the exact moment I realized that love, good intentions, and hard work do not protect you in this world. Paper protects you. Ironclad, legally binding, unassailable paper. And absolutely no one in my life needed that kind of airtight protection more than my parents. My father, Robert Hawthorne, was a vibrant, relentlessly active man. He was the kind of father who would spend his weekends building tree houses and fixing old engines. That all ended 19 years ago when a catastrophic workplace accident shattered his lumbar spine. He is not fully paralyzed, which is what the doctors originally feared. But the permanent nerve damage fundamentally altered the gravity of his world. A simple walk from the living room sofa to the kitchen sink cost him an immense amount of physical effort. His stamina is a fragile, finite resource that drains away within hours of waking up. I spent my teenage years watching him slowly transition from a man who could carry me on his shoulders to a man who had to quietly calculate whether he had enough energy left to stand up and greet a guest at the front door. He lives with chronic pain that he tries desperately to hide behind a tight smile. My mother, Elaine, responded to this tragedy the way she responded to every hardship in her life. She simply folded her own life away, tucking it into the back of a dark drawer so she could become his full-time caregiver. She quietly quit her job as a library archivist. She stopped attending her weekly garden club meetings. She gave away her sewing machine because the noise bothered him when his migraines flared up. She never complained. She never asked for outside help. And she absolutely refused to let her children see her break a sweat or shed a tear of frustration. She became the structural support column of our entire family, bearing an unbearable weight with a quiet, devastating stoicism that broke my heart every time I looked at her. Growing up, I watched my parents live a life of extreme, careful frugality. They clipped grocery coupons every Sunday morning. They drove used cars until the engines literally gave out on the highway, and they delayed their own retirement indefinitely just to make sure the endless stream of medical bills was paid and the lights stayed on. Yet, despite their own precarious financial situation, they were always the first to throw a lifeline to anyone else who was drowning. Almost always. That lifeline was thrown directly to Mallory. My older sister has always possessed a terrifying talent for making catastrophic financial decisions and dressing them up as brilliant entrepreneurial risks. Whether it was the artisan soap boutique she opened that went bankrupt after 8 months, or the disastrously leveraged real estate flip she attempted 5 years ago, Mallory always managed to dig herself into a deep, inescapable hole. And every single time the debt collectors started calling, my parents would quietly empty their modest savings accounts to bail her out. They never lectured her. They just absorbed the impact of her chaos, sacrificing their own thin margin of security so Mallory would not have to face the brutal consequences of her actions. I watched them hand over tens of thousands of dollars to save her credit score, knowing full well they were trading away their own peace of mind to do it. That is exactly why, when their 40th wedding anniversary approached, I knew with absolute certainty what I was not going to do. I was not going to buy them a luxury cruise to the Caribbean. I was not going to buy them a new sedan with heated seats, or a fancy set of commemorative gold jewelry. Those things are fleeting. They are fragile. They do not offer armor against the world. I wanted to give them something that could not be repossessed, borrowed against, or quietly drained away by a weeping sibling with a fresh crisis. I wanted to give them pure, unadulterated safety. The kind of safety that is anchored deep into the earth and protected by an impenetrable fortress of property law. It took me 2 full years of searching to find the right location. I spent my weekends touring dozens of properties across 3 different counties, walking through overgrown lots, swatting away mosquitoes, and negotiating with stubborn land brokers. Then, on a crisp Tuesday morning in late October, my real estate agent drove me out to a forgotten parcel of land on the edge of Lake Oconee. The property was a complete mess when I first saw it. It was severely overgrown with wild blackberry brambles and dominated by a rotting, collapsed wooden fishing shack from the 1970s. But the moment I stepped out of the car and let the engine die, I felt a profound shift in the atmosphere. The air was completely still, save for the gentle, rhythmic lapping of the water against the rocky shoreline. A dense line of mature pine trees formed a natural, protective barrier from the distant county road, creating an acoustic bubble of absolute silence. The land sloped gently and evenly toward the water, perfect for the wheelchair-accessible grading my father would desperately need. I walked down to the edge of the lake, my boots sinking slightly into the damp earth, and looked out over the glassy dark blue water. I could vividly picture my father sitting on a wide, sturdy wooden deck, a heavy wool blanket over his knees, finally able to watch the sun go down without fighting through a haze of physical pain. I could see my mother standing in a custom-designed kitchen, baking bread without constantly worrying about what the next hospital bill might cost, or when Mallory was going to call asking for another loan. I knew, standing right there with the cold autumn wind hitting my face, that this was not just a piece of real estate. I was not just buying dirt and water. This was a sanctuary. This was the one place on earth where, after decades of carrying the crushing weight of the world and the endless, chaotic burdens of my sister, my parents could finally sit down, close their tired eyes, and truly exhale. It was a place where they would never have to worry that tomorrow someone was going to knock on the door and take everything away. I managed the entire project like a covert military operation. For 14 months, my weekends completely vanished. I would tell my parents I had to fly out of state for emergency client meetings or tedious zoning board hearings. In reality, I was driving out to the county line in the freezing rain, standing in ankle-deep mud, and arguing with my general contractor about the exact turning radius required for a motorized wheelchair in a master bathroom. I smelled like wet concrete, cold coffee, and pine sawdust for over a year. I watched the old, rotting fishing shack get torn down to its foundation, feeling a strange, fierce sense of vindication as the heavy machinery cleared away the decay to make room for something permanent. I was completely unyielding about the physical specifications of the house. I rejected 3 different shipments of floor tiles because the friction coefficient was not high enough. I finally settled on a specialized matte, non-slip hardwood finish. I wanted a surface where my father's cane would grip the ground like iron, where a spilled glass of water would not turn the kitchen into a deadly hazard. I had the framing crew lower every single countertop in the house by exactly 4.5 inches. I eliminated every single threshold. A person could roll from the front driveway, through the heavy oak front door, across the living room, and out onto the sprawling back porch without feeling a single bump or encountering a single millimeter of elevation change. The bathroom safety fixtures were my personal victory. I hated the sterile, institutional look of stainless steel hospital bars. They scream of illness and decline. Instead, I hired a local artisan carpenter. I paid him double his usual rate to carve heavy, load-bearing grab bars out of solid reclaimed oak, integrating them seamlessly into the wainscoting and the shower walls. They looked like elegant architectural accents, but they could hold 300 pounds of dead weight without splintering. I hid a commercial-grade, completely silent backup generator behind a dense wall of evergreen shrubs, hardwired into a subterranean propane tank. If the county power grid failed during a brutal winter storm, the house would not even flicker. But bricks and wood can always be taken away if the paperwork is weak. The physical house was only the shell. The true gift was the invisible armor I built around it. I spent weeks drafting the legal framework, treating it with more intensity than a $100 million commercial merger. I established a fully funded long-term maintenance trust. I quietly transferred enough capital into it to prepay the property taxes, the private road maintenance fees, and the landscaping costs for the next 15 years. I installed a top-tier security system that was entirely discreet. There were no flashing red lights, no keypad alarms that beeped aggressively, and no visible exterior cameras to make my parents feel like they were living inside a correctional facility. I used only silent, passive window sensors and heavily reinforced deadbolts. The deed itself was my masterpiece. I did not simply put the title in their names. That would have left them vulnerable to coercion. Instead, I placed the property into an irrevocable living trust. I named my parents as the sole, exclusive lifetime beneficiaries. I authored the governing documents with ruthless precision. The language I deployed was absolute. It stated explicitly that my parents held the unassailable right of quiet enjoyment and residence until the end of their natural lives. I embedded a locked, unalterable poison pill clause stating the property could absolutely never be rented to a third party. It could never be utilized as collateral for any line of credit or mortgage. And the zoning or primary use could never be legally modified while either of them drew breath. I made the property completely legally radioactive to any predatory lender, debt collector, or ambitious relative. I executed all of this without whispering a single syllable to my sister. The silence was essential. Keeping a secret from Mallory is like trying to hold water in your bare hands, because she has a supernatural ability to detect hidden resources. If I had told her I was building a custom home for our parents, she would have immediately hijacked the narrative. She would have shown up at the construction site uninvited, offering unsolicited, terrible opinions on the paint swatches. She would have complained that the guest bedroom lacked a walk-in closet for her weekend wardrobe. And then, on the day I finally handed over the keys, she would have stood beside me, crying theatrical tears for the camera, happily accepting half the credit for a sanctuary she did not spend one dime or 1 minute creating. On the evening of their 40th wedding anniversary, the sky was a brilliant, bruised purple. I told them I had secured a reservation at a highly exclusive, out-of-town restaurant. My father wore a sharp tweed jacket that he had not put on in half a decade. My mother wore her best pearl necklace, the one she usually saved for funerals and baptisms. I drove them out of the city, navigating the winding rural highways as the shadows grew long. They chatted quietly in the back seat, assuming we were just going to eat an expensive steak and drive home. When I finally turned the steering wheel, guiding the sedan down the crushed gravel driveway, the property opened up before us. The cottage was a beacon against the encroaching night. I had programmed the exterior smart lights to illuminate the exact moment the sun dipped below the tree line, the wide front porch, the towering Georgia pines, and the stone chimney were bathed in a warm, welcoming golden glow. I put the car in park and killed the engine. My father slowly pushed his car door open. He gripped the door frame, hauling himself upright. He stood leaning heavily on his cane, the cold evening wind ruffling his gray hair. He stared at the gentle, sweeping ramp leading to the front door. He looked at the smoke curling lazily from the chimney, a fire I had asked the contractor to light exactly 1 hour before we arrived. He did not speak. The chronic, vibrating tension that usually radiated from his shoulders seemed to evaporate into the night air. I walked up the ramp, unlocked the heavy oak door, and pushed it open. I stepped aside to let them enter. The house smelled of fresh cedar, wood smoke, and absolute safety. My mother walked slowly into the kitchen, her eyes wide. She reached out with a trembling hand and ran her fingers over the lowered granite countertops. She pulled open a heavy culinary drawer, realizing instantly, with a sharp intake of breath, that she did not have to strain her back or lift her arms above her shoulders to reach the plates. She turned away from me, gripping the edge of the sink, and buried her face in her hands. She wept. It was not a quiet, polite cry. It was a deep, chest-rattling sob of pure, unadulterated relief. My father moved behind her, placing a steady hand on her shoulder, his own eyes shining with unshed tears. In that quiet, golden space, looking out through the massive glass windows at the dark water of the lake, they both realized someone had just handed them back a future they had voluntarily stopped dreaming about. It was the most profoundly perfect, pristine moment of my entire life. I stood by the door, watching them breathe easily for the first time in 2 decades. Then, my phone vibrated in the pocket of my wool coat. I pulled it out. Just 15 minutes earlier, as we were turning onto the county road, I had snapped a beautiful picture of the cottage glowing under the sunset. I sent it to the family group chat with a short, celebratory message announcing their anniversary surprise. The screen lit up with a new notification. It was a reply from Mallory. She did not use a single exclamation point. She did not ask if our mother was crying. She did not ask if our father felt comfortable navigating the space. Her response consisted of 2 rapid-fire questions that instantly sucked the warmth out of the room. How many acres is that land? Is there truck access down to the lake? Barely 48 hours had passed since the anniversary dinner when the isolation of the property was breached. I was back in the city, trapped in a grueling, multi-day zoning board hearing for a corporate client, leaving my parents alone to settle into their new rhythm. That was the exact window Mallory and her husband, Gavin Voss, chose to exploit. They arrived on a Saturday morning under the guise of a spontaneous weekend visit. They pulled up in Mallory's pristine white luxury vehicle, bringing an aggressive wave of manic energy that instantly disrupted the quiet sanctuary of the lake. They brought a $200 bottle of imported red wine and a box of artisan pastries from a high-end bakery downtown, wielding the expensive gifts like a Trojan horse. Their smiles were too wide, their hugs lingered a second too long, and their enthusiasm was sharp enough to cut glass. Gavin was the founder and chief executive officer of Cinder Shore Collective. If you looked at his company on social media, it appeared to be a massive success. It was a boutique hospitality brand specializing in luxury, off-grid aesthetic cabins for wealthy millennials. His feed was an endless scroll of minimalist A-frame structures, glowing fire pits, and influencers posing gracefully in front of floor-to-ceiling windows. But the curated digital illusion hid a catastrophic financial reality. Gavin had expanded into 3 different states over the course of 18 months, burning through millions in venture capital before establishing a sustainable revenue model. I knew from industry whispers that Cinder Shore Collective was bleeding cash at an alarming rate. They were over-leveraged, underbooked, and desperately running out of runway. During a lunch, my mother spent 2 hours preparing. Gavin did not bother to ask my father how his back was feeling after the move. He did not compliment the accessibility of the layout or mention how peaceful the water looked. Instead, he leaned over his plate of roasted chicken and began casually interrogating them. "So, Robert," Gavin said, swirling the expensive wine in his glass, "what is the structural load capacity on that wooden dock out there? Can it handle a motorized watercraft, or is it strictly for small rowboats?" My father, slightly confused by the sudden shift into technical specifications, set his fork down. "I am not entirely sure. Gavin, the contractor said it is sturdy enough for a few people to sit and fish." Right, Gavin nodded, pulling his phone out and tapping the screen. "And what about the winter water levels? Does the shoreline recede significantly? Have you guys checked the county zoning ordinances regarding secondary dwelling units? I noticed a lot of uncleared space near the eastern property line." The air in the dining room grew thick and uncomfortable. My parents exchanged a nervous glance. They were from a generation that viewed homeownership as a deeply personal, private matter. They did not understand why their son-in-law was dissecting their anniversary gift like a commercial real estate prospect. Mallory reached across the table and placed a perfectly manicured hand over my mother's wrist, offering a bright, synthetic laugh. "Oh, ignore him, Mom. You know how Gavin is. His brain just never turns off. He looks at a beautiful piece of land and instantly goes into developer mode. It is just harmless curiosity." But it was not curiosity. It was evaluation. Throughout the afternoon, Gavin casually dropped phrases that felt entirely alien in that warm, cedar-scented room. He referred to the untouched pine grove as untapped value. He pointed to the empty guest room and called it a dead asset. He kept circling back to the concept of family leverage, speaking in a rapid, confident cadence designed to overwhelm and disorient, while I was standing at a podium in a municipal building 70 miles away, arguing over commercial parking ratios. Mallory moved in for the emotional kill. She cornered my mother in the kitchen while they were clearing the plates. "Mom, this house is absolutely stunning," Mallory murmured, staring out the massive kitchen window at the shimmering lake. "But honestly, it is almost too beautiful to just let it sit here. It feels like a waste." My mother frowned, scrubbing a plate with unnecessary force. "A waste your father and I live here. Mallory, we are using it every single day." I know," Mallory replied quickly, smoothing her cashmere sweater. "But just the two of you, with all this space, you have to admit, it is a massive financial responsibility." That was the cue Gavin needed. He strolled into the kitchen, leaning casually against the doorframe. He presented his pitch with the smooth, practiced ease of a man who sold high-risk concepts for a living. "Mallory makes a valid point, Elaine," Gavin said, his voice dropping into a low, reassuring register. "We were just talking about how to protect you both long-term. You should really consider putting this property into a family limited liability company. Just a simple corporate structure to shield you from liability. If you let my team manage it, we could rent it out to a few, highly vetted, high-net-worth clients for just 30 or 40 days a year. The revenue would easily cover the property taxes, the maintenance, the utilities. We could even expand the footprint later, build a real Hawthorne legacy." My father wheeled himself into the entryway, his face dark with sudden anger. "Absolutely not," he said, his voice trembling slightly with the effort of projecting it. "This is our home. It is not a hotel. It is not a business. Nicole built this for us to have peace." But Mallory knew exactly where the armor was thinnest. She turned to face him, her eyes shining with manufactured concern. She weaponized the one thing my father could not defend against his guilt over my sacrifices. "Dad, be reasonable," Mallory pleaded, her voice cracking perfectly on the last word. "Do you really want your youngest daughter shouldering the financial burden of this place for the rest of her life? You know how many hours she works. You know how much of her own money she poured into this. Why not let the property feed itself if you love her? You should want to lift that weight off her shoulders." It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. She took my gift, twisted it into a burden, and offered herself as the savior. My father fell silent, the anger draining from his face, replaced instantly by a heavy, suffocating wave of guilt. He looked down at his hands, his knuckles white. He hated feeling like a financial drain on me. Mallory knew that, and she twisted the knife with surgical precision. They left it at that, allowing the toxic seed to plant itself in the quiet house. They spent the rest of the evening playing the role of the perfect, caring family, but the mask slipped just before sunset. My father had wheeled himself out onto the wraparound porch to get some fresh air and clear his head. The wind was loud, masking the sound of his tires rolling over the wood. As he reached the far corner of the deck, he heard a voice. Gavin was pacing on the crushed gravel driveway, his phone pressed tightly to his ear. His casual, friendly demeanor was completely gone. His posture was rigid, his free hand slicing through the air in frustration. "I know the deadline," Gavin hissed into the receiver, his voice tight with panic. "Listen to me. Just stall them for another 7 days. If we get the signatures this weekend, we can still save the bridge round. I am telling you, I have the collateral lined up. It is pristine equity. Just hold the investors off until Monday." My father froze. The cold wind bit through his sweater, but he did not feel it. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together in his mind. The aggressive questions about the land, the push for a corporate structure, the sudden, desperate concern for my financial well-being. It was never about a Hawthorne legacy. It was about saving a sinking ship. He slowly backed his wheelchair away from the edge of the porch, terrified that the squeak of a wheel would give him away. He retreated into the living room, his hands shaking so violently he could barely pull his cell phone from his pocket. He did not understand the intricate mechanisms of private equity or bridge loans, but he understood the sound of a desperate man plotting a theft. He opened his messages, found my name, and typed the only 4 words that mattered. My hand remained pressed flat against the thick, cream-colored cover of the master file. The stranger standing on the opposite side of the granite kitchen island froze. He was a young guy, probably fresh out of business school, and he clearly had no idea he had just walked into a minefield. He blinked rapidly, his hand hovering awkwardly over the glowing green button of his portable scanner. I did not wait for him to speak. I slid the heavy stack of documents out from underneath his hand and pulled them toward my chest. My eyes scanned the first page, then the second, then the third. My heart beat in a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. This was not a casual agreement between family members. This was a sophisticated, highly aggressive corporate takeover wrapped in standard boilerplate formatting. It was the exact kind of predatory structuring I spent 40 hours a week dismantling for corporate clients. The first section was the Articles of Incorporation for a new entity named Hawthorne Legacy Holdings. The second section was a limited power of attorney, specifically granting Gavin Voss the unilateral authority to execute financial decisions on behalf of the newly formed company. Next was a property management addendum, which outlined a usage schedule that effectively stripped my parents of their exclusive residency, allocating 90 days of the calendar year to corporate retreats and high-net-worth client leasing. But the true poison was buried deep in the middle of the stack. It was a completely innocuous-looking subheading titled, "Securing Financial Obligations." I looked up from the paper and locked eyes with the young man in the suit. "Who exactly do you work for?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. He shifted his weight nervously. "I am an independent signing agent. I am contracted through Vanguard Capital Equity. I was dispatched here to verify the digital signatures and finalize the collateral pledge for a commercial bridge loan." He was not a family attorney. He was not a wealth manager helping my parents plan their estate. He was a notary for a private equity lender, sent to rubber stamp the theft of my parents' home. I turned slowly to face Gavin. He was standing by the refrigerator, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his tailored slacks. He was trying to project an aura of relaxed confidence, but I could see a tiny, frantic pulse jumping in the hollow of his throat. "A collateral pledge," I repeated, letting the words hang in the tense air. I looked over at my father, who was still sitting rigidly in his wheelchair at the dining table. "Dad, they are not setting up a maintenance fund to pay the lawn care bills. If you sign this stack of paper, you are legally binding this cottage to a corporate shell company. You are handing Gavin the exploitation rights to this property. He is going to take those rights and present them to his investors and his private lenders as secured collateral to bail out his failing hospitality business." The color completely drained from my mother's face. She grabbed the edge of the dining table as if the floor had suddenly dropped out from underneath her. Gavin immediately stepped forward, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. He deployed his best boardroom voice, the one designed to soothe anxious venture capitalists. "Nicole, you are wildly overreacting. You are reading things out of context. This is strictly preliminary paperwork. It is just a pre-approval framework we are setting up, just in case the family decides to move forward with a commercial strategy down the line. It does not actually execute anything today." "Is that right?" I asked. I flipped past the incorporation documents, past the property management addendums, and went straight to page 47. I knew exactly where the trapdoor would be hidden. I found the enforcement clauses. "Let us hear what the preliminary framework actually says," I said, raising my voice so it echoed clearly off the high cedar ceilings. I read the text out loud, articulating every single syllable with razor-sharp precision. Section 12, Paragraph 4. In the event the operating entity requires a cash flow restructuring to meet outstanding capital obligations, the managing member, being Gavin Voss, retains the absolute, irrevocable right to commercialize, lease, encumber, or liquidate the physical asset to satisfy said debts." I slapped the file down onto the granite counter. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. "It means," I said, looking directly at my sister, "that when Cinder Shore Collective inevitably defaults on its next round of funding, Vanguard Capital Equity gets to foreclose on this house. It means you were going to let the bank take our parents' home so you could keep playing pretend on the internet." Mallory's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. For the first time in her life, she had absolutely no script to fall back on. I turned my attention back to my father. He looked physically ill. The uncapped fountain pen was still resting on the table in front of him. "Dad," I said, my voice softening just a fraction, "tell me exactly what you signed before I walked through that door." My father swallowed hard. His hands were shaking. "I did not sign the thick book. He said I needed to read it first, but Gavin said the homeowner's insurance policy was out of date. He said they needed to pull the property records to get a better premium quote. I signed a single digital form on the tablet." I looked at the signing agent. "Show me the authorization screen." The young man scrambled to unlock his tablet and turned the screen toward me. It was an authorization to disclose property information and encumbrances. It was not a deed transfer, and it did not finalize the holding company. But it was disastrous enough. It granted Gavin the legal authority to share the private property details, the tax records, and the appraisal values with his private lenders. My father had unknowingly given Gavin the exact key he needed to open the first door. I reached out, grabbed the tablet, and canceled the active session. I handed the device back to the agent. "Pack up your equipment," I ordered, my tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "You have exactly 2 minutes to exit this property. If you are not in your vehicle and driving up that gravel road by the time I am done taking pictures, I will call the county sheriff and have you arrested for criminal trespass." The agent did not argue. He practically threw his scanner into his leather briefcase, muttered a frantic apology to no one in particular, and bolted for the front door. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket. I stood over the kitchen island and methodically photographed every single page of the Hawthorne Legacy Holdings dossier. I made sure the lighting was perfect. I made sure every single fraudulent clause, every single predatory addendum, and every single signature line was captured in high-resolution detail. I pulled the small flash drive containing the local scans out of the machine's base and dropped it into my pocket. Then, I turned to face my sister. Mallory was already crying. Her eyes were red, and her chest was heaving with dramatic, jagged breaths. "You are destroying this family," she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly in the quiet house. "You are so controlling." "Nicole, we were just trying to build something together. We were trying to make sure Mom and Dad had real wealth, and you just want to keep them trapped here so you can play the hero." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. "Pick up your coat, Mallory," I said, staring at her with total detachment. "Get out of my house. From this exact second forward, every single piece of communication you have with this family goes through my email. Do not call my phone. Do not text my mother. If you step foot on this property again, I will file a restraining order." Mallory let out a loud, theatrical sob, grabbing her designer handbag from the sofa. She stormed toward the front door, her heavy boots stomping against the hardwood floor. She did not look back at my parents. Gavin was slower to move. He buttoned his suit jacket, his face pale, his jaw set in a tight, furious line. His grand financial rescue operation had just burned to the ground in less than 10 minutes. He walked slowly toward the entryway, his eyes fixed on the floor. Just as he reached the threshold of the heavy oak door, he stopped. He turned his head slowly, looking back at me where I stood in the center of the kitchen. The fake charm was completely gone. His eyes were cold, calculating, and vicious. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping into a low, terrifying whisper that only I could hear over the sound of the wind blowing across the porch. "You always thought you were the only one in this family who knew how to use paper as a weapon." 72 hours after I threw Gavin out of the kitchen, the phantom attacks began. It did not happen with a loud knock on the door or a physical confrontation. It happened silently, through the fiber optic cables and automated email servers that govern modern real estate. The real war was not going to be fought on the beautiful wraparound porch of the Lakeside Cottage. It was going to be fought in the digital architecture of the county recording system. On Tuesday morning, my phone buzzed with an automated alert from the property insurance carrier. Someone had initiated a request to increase the liability coverage from a standard residential policy to a commercial-grade hospitality package. 2 hours later, an email arrived from the county utility board, noting a pending request to reroute the monthly billing statements to a corporate post office box in the city. By mid-afternoon, a local marine construction company left a voicemail on my work phone, confirming they had received an inquiry regarding a 200-square-foot commercial dock expansion at the lake. They were testing the perimeter. Gavin was using the single, seemingly harmless authorization form my father had mistakenly signed to probe the weak points in my administrative armor. Then came the red flag that made my blood run cold. I had placed a permanent, high-security freeze on the property title the moment I purchased the land. On Wednesday, the monitoring service triggered a priority alert. A hard credit inquiry had been filed against the property's equity. The query originated from a boutique private equity fund that specialized in acquiring distressed assets from failing tech startups and over-leveraged hospitality brands. While Gavin was working the financial backchannels, my sister was running a synchronized psychological campaign on social media. I do not follow Mallory online, but mutual friends immediately began sending me screenshots. Her timeline was flooded with long, cryptic paragraphs about toxic family dynamics. She wrote impassioned posts about people who use their wealth to manipulate the elderly. She posted a quote about how true generosity does not demand absolute control, and how heartbreaking it is when financial gifts are just a mechanism to hold parents as emotional hostages. I did not reply. I did not engage in the public theater. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was laying the groundwork for a victim narrative, if this ever ended up in civil court. She was building a public timeline portraying me as a financial tyrant, making her and Gavin look like the concerned, rescuing family members who were just trying to free our parents from my overbearing grip. I needed to know exactly what Gavin was selling to that distressed asset fund. I made a quiet phone call to a former colleague who now worked as a senior underwriter in commercial appraisals. It cost me a very expensive bottle of scotch and a favor I would eventually have to repay. But by Thursday evening, I had the answer. Gavin was completely out of time. His hospitality company had a massive, 7-figure mezzanine bridge loan maturing in exactly 3 weeks. The lenders were threatening to call the note, which would trigger a total corporate liquidation and personal bankruptcy, to secure an extension and save his company. Gavin needed to present a new, high-value asset anchored to his brand. He needed a pristine, debt-free flagship property to prove to his investors that his company was still expanding. And he had already named it. He was circulating a glossy pitch deck to venture capitalists for a new luxury retreat called the Hawthorne House Residency. He was using the high-resolution sunset photographs I had proudly sent to the family group chat on the night of the anniversary. He was aggressively selling my parents' home before he even legally owned it. The pieces were locking together. But one massive legal hurdle remained. Even with the initial authorization form, Gavin could not transfer the deed or pledge the property without my parents passing a rigorous digital identity verification process. Lenders require government-issued identification, face scans, and matched biometrics to prevent exactly this kind of corporate fraud. I called my mother on Friday morning. Her voice was thin and shaky when she answered the phone. "Mom, I need you to think very carefully," I said, keeping my tone as gentle and measured as possible. "Did you ever send Mallory copies of your driver's licenses or passports?" There was a long, terrible silence on the line. I could hear the faint sound of the wind coming off the lake through the receiver. Then, my mother began to cry. "She said she needed them for a surprise," my mother whispered, her voice breaking with fresh devastation. "She told me she was building a digital family tree and a commemorative video montage for the 40th anniversary. She said the software required official government dates and locations to verify the historical timeline. I went to the library down the street and scanned them for her. I sent them right to her email." I closed my eyes. My sister had weaponized my mother's pure, unconditional love. Mallory had exploited our mother's excitement over a fake family project to harvest the exact biometric data they needed to steal the house. I hung up the phone and immediately retained an independent digital forensics contractor. I gave him the routing numbers and the document tracking codes from the portable scanner I had photographed in the kitchen during the confrontation. I needed to see exactly how far Gavin had penetrated the electronic signature portals. The forensic report came back late Friday night. It was worse than I had anticipated. A complete set of holding company documents had already been generated and uploaded to a third-party legal portal. The system had automatically approved the identity verification step, matching the uploaded high-resolution scans of my parents' licenses perfectly. But the digital footprint told the real, undeniable story. The Internet Protocol address that submitted the verification did not originate from the secure wireless network I had installed at the lake. It traced back to a public internet connection at a franchised coffee shop exactly 2 miles down the road from Mallory's suburban house. They were attempting to forge a digital closing in real time, hoping I would be too slow to block the final electronic execution. They thought they could finalize the collateral pledge before the weekend was over. I was sitting at my kitchen island in the city, staring blankly at the forensic trace logs, when a new notification chimed loudly on my laptop. It was an automated email from the county clerk's digital tracking system, alerting me to a newly filed document attached to the Lakeside parcel. I clicked the secure link. The file downloaded instantly to my desktop. I opened the PDF. The bold black header read, "Affirmation of Managerial Authority." It was a sworn legal declaration, granting Gavin Voss full executive control over the property. It effectively attempted to override my ironclad trust structure by fraudulently claiming the primary beneficiaries had officially elected to commercialize the asset for their own financial gain. I scrolled slowly down to the bottom of the page. Right there, perfectly aligned on the digital signature line, was my father's signature. The biometric stamp, the embedded timecode, and the cryptographic security certificate were absolutely flawless. It was a perfect, unassailable forgery. If I did not understand the intricate, hidden mechanics of real estate fraud, and if I did not have the forensic location report sitting on my desk proving my father was 70 miles away when this document was executed, I would have looked at that screen and believed he had actually surrendered his home. The digital forensics report did not just expose the forged electronic signature. It laid bare a truth so deeply unsettling that it fundamentally altered how I viewed my own blood. For days, a small, naive part of me had desperately wanted to believe that Mallory was just a passive, oblivious participant in this scheme. I wanted to think Gavin had manipulated her, blinding her with corporate jargon and false promises of generational wealth, just as he had tried to blind our parents. But as I dug deeper into the metadata and the intercepted communication logs provided by my security contractor, that comforting illusion shattered completely. My sister was not a victim. She was the architect, buried within the email chains forwarded to the underwriters at Vanguard Capital Equity. I found a direct message sent from Mallory's personal email address. It was dated 4 days before the ambush at the cottage. In the email, she formally introduced herself to the loan officers as the primary family liaison. She explicitly described the Lakeside Cottage as a jointly owned family asset with an agreed-upon development direction. She assured the lenders that the older generation was fully on board and that the final paperwork was merely a formality awaiting a weekend family gathering. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Mallory knew exactly what she was doing. I spent an entire evening piecing together public financial filings and court records related to Cinder Shore Collective. The picture painted by the data was grim. If Gavin failed to secure this final bridge loan, his hospitality empire would not just file for corporate bankruptcy. The creditors would pierce the corporate veil because Gavin had personally guaranteed the previous rounds of funding. If the company went under, the bank would immediately seize Mallory's massive, 5-bedroom suburban house. She was going to lose her status, her country club membership, and her perfectly curated lifestyle. To prevent her own financial ruin, she looked at the pristine, debt-free sanctuary I had built for our exhausted parents and decided to throw it into the fire as a sacrificial offering. She viewed our parents as an expendable resource. I refused to let emotion dictate my strategy. Anger makes you sloppy, and I needed to be flawlessly precise. I quietly retained a highly aggressive, independent title attorney and a specialized municipal records archivist. We spent 3 days drafting a comprehensive legal counterattack, preparing lawsuits for fraudulent conveyance, identity theft, and tortious interference. But I deliberately instructed my legal team not to file the injunctions just yet. I did not want to merely swat Gavin away from the property. If I struck too early, he would just retreat, claim a misunderstanding, and look for another angle of attack. I wanted him to commit entirely. I needed him to drag his investors, his lenders, and his shell companies out into the open so I could sever every single financial lifeline he had left. While I prepared the legal trap in the city, the emotional collateral damage at the lake was becoming unbearable. For the first time in their 40-year marriage, a profound and bitter rift opened between my parents. My mother, completely terrified by the escalating conflict, simply wanted the nightmare to end. "Nicole, please," my mother begged over the phone, her voice trembling with exhaustion. "Just let us take out a small loan against the house for them. I cannot stand this fighting. I just want this to be over quietly. Let them have something so we can have peace." She was willing to surrender her own safety just to restore the artificial peace of our family. My father, however, reacted with a cold, devastating silence. The incident with the digital signature had wounded his pride in a way his physical injury never could. For 19 years, he had fought to maintain his dignity from a wheelchair. Now, he realized his own eldest daughter looked at him and saw nothing but a feeble, gullible old man who could be easily tricked into signing away his own sanctuary. He sat on the back porch for hours, staring out at the water, refusing to speak about the situation. He felt utterly violated. I had to build a digital fortress around them before Gavin could launch his next strike. Working late into the night, I initiated comprehensive credit freezes on both of my parents with all the major credit bureaus. I purged all of their existing passwords, revoked every authorized device, and established strict, hardware-based two-factor authentication for every bank account, insurance policy, and medical portal they possessed. I placed specialized alerts on the county land records system, ensuring that if anyone even queried the parcel number, my phone would ring instantly. I also linked the discrete exterior security cameras to a dedicated server, logging every single vehicle that passed the property line. Over the next week, the cameras recorded Gavin's black pickup truck slowly cruising past the private driveway on 4 separate occasions. Then, the archivist I hired uncovered the final piece of Gavin's grand delusion. It turned out the surveyor stakes I had ripped out of the lawn were not just for a simple property line confirmation. Through a backdoor inquiry at the county zoning office, my archivist obtained a set of preliminary architectural renderings that Gavin had quietly submitted for a fast-track environmental review. I sat at my desk, staring at the blueprints on my monitor in absolute disgust. He was not planning to rent the cottage out for a few weeks a year to cover the taxes. He had commissioned a massive, multi-phase commercial compound. The plans detailed the construction of 3 separate auxiliary cabins scattered through the protected pine grove. They included a luxury cedar sauna built directly on the shoreline and a massive, deep-water commercial dock designed to accommodate multiple motorized watercraft. He was branding it as an exclusive, high-tier guest experience. He was taking the quiet, wheelchair-accessible haven I built for my disabled father and attempting to transform it into a noisy, high-traffic party resort to scam his venture capital investors into giving him more money. He was so deeply entrenched in his own lies that he had already started spending money on the development phase. He believed he was invincible. On Friday morning, I drove down to the county land registry office to finalize my preparations. I needed to verify that the chain of title was still perfectly clean before I initiated the final stage of my plan. The clerk, a woman I had worked with on dozens of commercial zoning cases, handed me the printed property abstract over the counter. I scanned the document, expecting to see nothing but the ironclad trust I had established. Instead, my eyes locked onto a newly registered line item, filed just 24 hours prior. My breath caught in my throat. I stood perfectly still in the middle of the bustling municipal office, a wave of pure ice washing over my chest. Right there, officially recorded against the deed of the Lakeside Cottage, was a formal notice of development option. It was filed by an obscure corporate entity called Cindershore Holdings. It was not a full transfer of ownership, but in the realm of real estate law. It was a catastrophic infection. It was a legal cloud placed directly on the title, formally notifying the public that a commercial entity held a vested financial interest in the development rights of the land. Gavin had not waited for the final signatures. He had used the forged managerial affirmation to bypass the system and stake a legally binding claim on my parents' home. He had successfully poisoned the deed. The fraudulent notice of development option did exactly what Gavin intended it to do. It acted like a financial and administrative quarantine. The immediate casualty was a critical safety upgrade I had scheduled for the waterfront. I had contracted a specialized marine engineering firm to install heavy-duty, waist-high aluminum safety rails along the entire perimeter of the wooden dock, ensuring my father could fish without the risk of a catastrophic fall. On Tuesday morning, the foreman called my office. He sounded incredibly uncomfortable. He explained that his office manager had pulled the municipal permit records and found the active commercial development flag attached to the deed. He canceled the job immediately. Contractors despise disputed properties. They will not pour concrete or install permanent fixtures on a site paralyzed by management issues or corporate ownership battles. In a matter of days, Gavin had successfully weaponized the public record to isolate my parents' home from essential outside services. Gavin wasted absolutely no time exploiting the administrative chaos he had engineered. Knowing the property was now legally ambiguous on paper, He aggressively moved forward with his real-world timeline. Through a mutual contact in the commercial real estate sector, I learned that Cinder Shore Collective had officially scheduled an investor walkthrough at the cottage for the upcoming Saturday afternoon. He was bringing representatives from 2 major venture capital firms to tour the grounds. Boldly acting as the legitimate managing director of a site he was actively trying to steal. The psychological warfare escalated on Thursday evening. My cell phone rang while I was reviewing municipal zoning codes in my apartment. The caller identification showed an unfamiliar local number. I answered, and my sister's voice immediately filled the line. She had purchased a prepaid burner phone just to bypass the block I had placed on her personal number. She was sobbing, but it was not the theatrical, manipulative crying she usually deployed. This sounded frantic. It sounded like a woman staring over the edge of a steep cliff. She begged me to call off my lawyers and let the Saturday meeting happen. She promised that if the walkthrough went smoothly, the investors would release the bridge loan. She swore that all the corporate debt would be cleared. She would save her suburban mansion, and our parents could keep the cottage without any further interference. No one actually loses anything, she pleaded, her breath hitching in the receiver. We can just go back to being a family. Please do not take my life away just to prove a point. Sitting in the quiet of my apartment, listening to her desperate rationalizations, the true horror of her strategy became crystal clear. My sister was not staging a sudden, violent robbery. She was orchestrating a slow, agonizing erosion of our moral boundaries. She wanted to drag our entire family across the line of fraud, inch by inch, forcing us to accept the lie as a necessary sacrifice for her survival. She truly believed that because she needed the money more. Our parents were obligated to surrender their security to provide it. By the time anyone realized how far we had crossed into the dark, there would be no road back. Back at the lake, the emotional foundation of the house was fracturing under the immense pressure of the siege. My father, normally a stoic and gentle man, was consumed by a quiet, rigid fury. He was furious at Gavin, but his deepest, most agonizing anger was directed at the humiliating reality that his own eldest daughter viewed him as the weakest link in the chain. She saw a disabled old man who could be easily confused by legal jargon and exploited for his signature. Meanwhile, my mother was completely hollowed out by grief. She spent her days weeping quietly in the kitchen, overwhelmed by the crushing guilt of having voluntarily emailed the biometric identification scans to Mallory. She felt entirely responsible for handing the enemy the keys to the gates. The sanctuary I built to bring them peace had been transformed into a suffocating psychological prison. On Friday afternoon, I opened the encrypted portal connected to the discreet exterior security cameras I had installed around the property. I watched the live video feed from the camera hidden under the eaves of the back patio. A black luxury sedan pulled into the driveway. Gavin stepped out, accompanied by a young man carrying heavy equipment cases. It was a freelance architectural photographer, hired to capture advanced staging shots for the final investment portfolio. I turned the audio feed up to maximum volume. Gavin leaned casually against the custom cedar railing, lighting a cigarette while the photographer adjusted his heavy lenses. The wind carried Gavin's voice perfectly into the hidden microphone. "Do not worry about the current residents," Gavin told the photographer, exhaling a thick cloud of smoke into the pristine air. "Just shoot around them. We just need the old folks to nod along in front of the money tomorrow, and the narrative is completely clean." The sheer sociopathic arrogance of that statement made my blood run cold. He was planning to use my parents as living props in his fraudulent presentation to legitimize the theft of their own home. But the final, most unexpected twist of the entire ordeal arrived in my encrypted inbox just 2 hours later. I received an email from an anonymous address. The subject line contained a specific, silly childhood nickname that only one person in the world ever used for me. It was Mallory's 16-year-old daughter. She had spent the last month suffocating under the toxic, panicked atmosphere inside her parents' house, listening to their hushed, desperate arguments through the thin drywall, sickened by their endless lies and the constant manipulation of her grandparents. She had quietly accessed her father's unlocked laptop while he was out of the house. Attached to the email was the comprehensive, minute-by-minute itinerary for the Saturday investor walkthrough, along with the finalized, high-resolution pitch deck Gavin planned to distribute to the venture capitalists. I opened the presentation and stared at the glossy pages outlining the exact financial execution of my parents' home. Staring at those slides, a profound shift occurred in my mind. For weeks, my entire strategy had been defensive. I had been scrambling to block his moves, freeze the accounts, and prepare the injunctions. But quietly stopping the transaction in a courtroom on a Monday morning was no longer sufficient. If I simply chased Gavin away, he would just retreat into the shadows, restructure his lies, and find another vulnerable angle to attack my family. I realized I did not just want to intercept this plan anymore. I wanted to drag the entire rotting conspiracy out into the blinding light of day. I was going to let the investor walkthrough happen exactly as scheduled. I was going to let him bring the money right to the front door. And then, I was going to systematically dismantle his entire life in front of the exact people he needed to survive. I stopped reacting. The panic that had been vibrating behind my ribs for the past 2 weeks completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, singular focus. I was no longer a frantic daughter trying to patch the holes in a sinking ship. I was a senior director of land entitlement, and I was about to execute a hostile demolition. On Thursday morning, I initiated a synchronized legal strike. I did not file the injunctions blindly. Instead, I coordinated my team. I called my independent title attorney, the digital forensics expert who traced the forged signatures, a licensed civil investigator, and my contact at the county recording office. We spent 6 hours drafting the exact legal instruments required to expunge the fraudulent notice of development option and permanently clear the title cloud from the property. But I gave them strict orders to hold the filings. We were not going to serve Gavin in a quiet, empty courtroom on a random Tuesday. I was going to let his investor walkthrough happen exactly as he had planned it. I was going to let him dress up, bring his venture capitalists to the lake, and present his grand illusion. I just needed to make sure my own audience was in the room when the curtain dropped. I opened my laptop and drafted a carefully calibrated email to Mallory and Gavin. I knew exactly which psychological buttons to push. I stripped away all my usual professional armor and wrote using the passive, exhausted tone they desperately wanted to hear. I typed that the fighting was tearing our parents apart and that I was finally willing to sit down and hear their final proposal for the sake of the family. I conceded that perhaps a structured compromise was the only way to avoid a devastating legal war. I knew Mallory would read that email and feel a profound, triumphant rush of relief. She would believe her campaign of emotional attrition had worked. She would think I had finally cracked under the pressure of keeping the peace. In the second paragraph of the email, I set the terms. I requested that the meeting take place at the Lakeside Cottage on Saturday afternoon, fully integrating my surrender into Gavin's scheduled investor tour. I explicitly stated that our parents would be present, along with the financial representatives Gavin had invited. I added one final, seemingly innocuous condition. I told them I was bringing a neutral records consultant just to help my parents understand the administrative transition. Gavin replied less than 20 minutes later. His response was dripping with magnanimous victory. He agreed to all terms. He had no idea the neutral consultant was actually my aggressive title litigation attorney, with the stage officially set. I spent the entirety of Friday meticulously building the traps. I stood in the sterile glow of the firm's copy room, listening to the rhythmic, mechanical hum of the heavy-duty commercial printer. I was not just printing documents, I was assembling execution dossiers. I created 6 identical, perfectly bound, thick black folders. Inside each one, I organized the evidence with lethal chronological precision. The first section contained the pristine, unassailable chain of title and the irrevocable trust documents, proving my parents held absolute, exclusive lifetime rights. The second section held the digital forensics report, highlighting the exact internet protocol address from the franchised coffee shop, definitively proving the electronic signatures were forged by someone miles away from the lake. The third section was the most damaging. It contained high-resolution color printouts of the pitch deck Gavin was using to defraud his investors. Placed directly next to the unauthorized architectural blueprints for the saunas and commercial docks. I followed that with the intercepted emails Mallory had sent directly to Vanguard Capital Equity, where she explicitly lied about the family consensus. I did not rely solely on paper. I synced my tablet to the hidden patio camera's encrypted server. I isolated the audio file from the previous afternoon, enhancing the vocal track so there would be absolutely no ambient distortion. I queued up the exact 10-second clip where Gavin arrogantly told his photographer that he just needed the old folks to nod along to wash the narrative clean. I packed the 6 dossiers into my heavy leather briefcase, locked my office, and drove out to the lake. The atmosphere inside the cottage on Friday night was suffocating. The air felt heavy, charged with the kind of thick, vibrating tension that precedes a violent storm. My mother had retreated to the master bedroom shortly after dinner, unable to bear the anxiety of the impending confrontation. I found my father sitting alone in the dark living room. The television was off, only the faint, ambient glow of the smart lights illuminated the space. His wheelchair was positioned to face the massive glass windows overlooking the black, completely still water of the lake. I walked over and sat down heavily on the edge of the sofa near him. We sat in absolute silence for a long time. "I am not afraid of losing this house, Nicole," my father finally said. His voice was a raspy whisper, rough with an exhaustion that went far deeper than his physical injuries. He kept his eyes fixed on the distant tree line. "We lived with nothing before. We could live with nothing again. Bricks and wood do not scare me." I turned to look at his profile in the dim light. "Then what scares you?" "Dad." He gripped the armrests of his chair. His knuckles were pale. "I am terrified that tomorrow afternoon, when all of this is dragged out into the open, I am going to lose my eldest daughter forever. If you show those people what Mallory has done, there is no coming back from it. The family breaks permanently." My heart ached for him, even after everything Mallory had orchestrated, even after she had viewed him as expendable collateral. His instinct as a father was still to mourn the fracture of his family. He was grieving a daughter who was still alive but had chosen greed over his safety. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. I kept my voice steady, stripped of all anger, leaving only the cold, undeniable truth. "Dad, the family is already broken," I said softly. "Mallory broke it the minute she looked at your peace of mind and decided to trade it for a bridge loan. If we sit here tomorrow and stay silent just to protect her feelings, we are not keeping the family together. We are just helping her burn your life down. The scariest thing we can do right now is let her believe that this kind of betrayal has no consequences." My father did not argue. He slowly closed his eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath. He looked incredibly old in that moment, carrying the crushing weight of a failure that was not his own. He knew I was right, but acknowledging it required a kind of brutal courage he had never been forced to use against his own blood. He reached out and placed his trembling hand over mine. His grip was surprisingly strong, anchoring us both in the quiet dark. He opened his eyes and looked directly at me. The hesitation was completely gone. The sorrow remained, but beneath it was a bedrock of absolute resolve. Tomorrow," my father said, his voice finding a firm, unyielding strength that echoed in the quiet room. "Do not save me from the conflict. Save the house." Saturday afternoon arrived with a crisp breeze off the lake, right on schedule at 2:00. A convoy of 3 expensive cars crunched down the gravel driveway. Gavin stepped out of his vehicle, wearing a tailored blazer and a brilliantly confident smile. He was accompanied by 2 venture capitalists dressed in expensive casual wear and a stern woman holding a leather briefcase, whom I immediately recognized from her corporate profile as the senior underwriter for Vanguard Capital Equity. Gavin ushered them into the house, completely blind to the absolute destruction waiting inside. Mallory took the center stage in the living room. She stood gracefully in front of the stone fireplace, placing a hand over her heart, and began a deeply rehearsed monologue about keeping the Hawthorne legacy alive. She spoke passionately about transforming the property into a sustainable family enterprise, framing the commercialization of our parents' home as an act of profound filial piety and practical financial management. She smiled warmly at the investors, promising them a seamless, unified transition. I let her speak for exactly 8 minutes. I did not interrupt her once. I did not sigh or roll my eyes. I simply sat there and watched them dig their own graves with undeniable enthusiasm. When Mallory finally concluded her pitch with a breathless, hopeful smile, she looked at me, expecting either a screaming match or a quiet, defeated surrender. I gave her neither. I stood up, picked up the stack of 6 heavy black dossiers from the kitchen island, and walked over to the custom dining table. I placed one folder directly in front of each person. "Before anyone signs a term sheet or agrees to a capital injection," I said, my voice echoing coldly in the quiet room, "I suggest you review the actual legal reality of the asset you are standing in." My neutral records consultant leaned forward, folding his hands precisely on top of his dossier. He looked directly at the Vanguard underwriter. "My name is Arthur Sterling," he said, dropping the disguise entirely. "I am a senior title litigation attorney representing the true owner, for the legal record. The man standing next to the fireplace possesses absolutely zero exploitation rights to this property. The asset is held in an irrevocable trust with strict, unalterable commercial use prohibitions. The collateral descriptions submitted to your financial institutions were entirely fabricated by Mallory Voss. Furthermore, the development notice currently attached to this deed is a fraudulent filing, backed by forged digital verification logs." Gavin's confident smile vanished instantly, replaced by a sickly, pale mask of shock. Mallory let out a small, confused gasp, clutching her designer handbag against her chest. I did not give them a single second to recover. I picked up the television remote and cast my tablet screen to the large monitor mounted on the living room wall. The glossy cover of Gavin's pitch deck for the Hawthorne House residency filled the massive screen. "You promised your investors an exclusive, debt-free anchor property," I said, locking eyes with Gavin. "But you neglected to mention that the current residents never agreed to any of this." I tapped the screen again. The audio file I had isolated from the hidden patio camera began to play through the surround sound speakers. Gavin's own voice, crystal clear and dripping with absolute arrogance, filled the room. "Just shoot around them. We just need the old folks to nod along in front of the money tomorrow, and the narrative is completely clean." The silence that followed was absolute and devastating. The 2 venture capitalists did not even bother opening their dossiers. They exchanged a single, grim look, stood up simultaneously, and began buttoning their coats. They understood immediately that they had been lured out to the lake to view an asset completely outside of Gavin's control. The Vanguard underwriter was furious. Her face flushed dark red as she slammed her leather briefcase shut. Her eyes turned to ice when she realized the multi-million-dollar mortgage file Gavin had submitted was built entirely on false pretenses and legally radioactive land. They walked out the front door without saying a single word of goodbye. Just as the heavy oak door clicked shut behind the fleeing money, the final layer of the trap sprang closed. 2 men walked up the wooden ramp to the porch. It was my licensed civil investigator and the county records agent. I opened the door for them. The investigator walked straight up to Gavin and pressed a thick manila envelope against his chest. It was the formal legal summons for fraudulent conveyance and a mandatory demand to immediately strike the falsified development notice from the county registry. Mallory began to hyperventilate. She fell onto the sofa, sobbing wildly, trying to grab her husband's arm. "Gavin, tell them it is a mistake. Tell them we are just trying to save the house." I walked over to the coffee table and opened Mallory's dossier to the very last page. I pointed to a specific paragraph highlighted in bright yellow ink. "He is not trying to save your house." "Mallory," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper, "read the indemnity clause in his draft agreement with Vanguard Capital. If this Lakeside project failed, or if the bridge loan defaulted again, Gavin structured the corporate shell so that the liability would pierce your personal assets first. He built a legal exit hatch for himself and left you standing directly on the trap door. He was going to let the bank take your suburban mansion to protect his own bankruptcy filings. Mallory stared at the highlighted paper. Her tears stopped instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. She looked up at the man she had conspired with, the man she had betrayed her own parents for, and realized he had viewed her as just another expendable asset. She physically recoiled from him, burying her face in her hands, completely and utterly broken. Then, the sound of a heavy metal brake locking echoed in the room. My father, Robert, gripped the wheels of his chair and pushed himself backward, giving himself enough room to maneuver. He grabbed the heavy oak grab bar I had installed on the wall. His arms shook violently with the effort, his face tight with chronic pain. But he forced himself upright. He stood on his own 2 feet, towering over the ruins of Gavin's ambition. He looked directly at his eldest daughter. His voice was rough, trembling, but it did not retreat a single inch. "The door to this house will always be open to you," my father said, his words falling like heavy stones. "But only if you walk through it as a daughter. You will never, ever step foot on this property again, acting like a landlord demanding rights to a sanctuary your sister built for her parents." My mother, Elaine, stepped forward and wrapped her arm firmly around my father's waist, supporting his weight. She did not cry. She did not plead for everyone to calm down. For the very first time in my entire life, she did not try to buy an artificial peace by surrendering to Mallory's chaos. She stood calmly and resolutely beside her husband. Gavin had absolutely nothing left to say. Stripped of his leverage, his investors, and his lies, he turned and walked out of the house in total defeat. Mallory followed a few minutes later, refusing to even look at him as they walked out to their separate cars. By 6 o'clock that evening, the heavy black pickup truck and the white luxury vehicle were completely gone from the gravel driveway. The fraudulent records were scheduled for formal removal on Monday morning. Gavin's failing empire was guaranteed to collapse before the end of the month, completely burying him under the weight of his own toxic debt. The 3 of us sat out on the wide, wooden back porch. The sky had turned a deep, bruised purple, reflecting beautifully off the glassy surface of the lake. The air was cool and entirely silent. I opened a bottle of vintage champagne I had hidden in the back of the refrigerator and poured 3 glasses. My father raised his glass, his hand finally steady. My mother smiled, a genuine, relaxed expression that erased a decade of stress from her face. We clinked our glasses together, finally completing the 40th anniversary celebration that had been so violently interrupted. Sitting there in the fading evening light, watching my parents breathe easily, I realized the absolute truth. The greatest gift I had given them was not the non-slip hardwood floors, the reinforced grab bars, or the beautiful view of the water. The true gift was the unassailable legal boundary I had drawn around them. I had built a fortress strong enough to ensure that their unconditional love could never again be used as collateral. Thank you all so much for listening to this story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below with your city or country so we can chat and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, hit that like button, and show your support by clicking the hype button so this video can reach even more people who need to hear it.